Hello, you're very welcome to the week that really was with John McGurk and Sarah Ryan. It is the 10th of August 2023, and my friends, am bereft because we have no Sarah Ryan. She has buggered off to Greece to the family estates for 3 weeks and left me on my own. But I'm delighted to announce that I have a more than able replacement, somebody who's been my friend for many years, who has been a pro-life campaigner of note in this country for a long time. But more than that, a campaigner for the Irish language, an excellent traditional musician, somebody with opinions on lots of things, who happens to write for Gript. That is Miss Niamh UI BHRIAN. Niamh, you're very welcome.
Thanks, John. What a great intro.
Thank you. It's a delight to have you here. It's been a fascinating week. How did you spend it?
Well, looking at, I suppose, at a lot of the madness that's occurring in the country, and I think somebody who seems to have noticed some of the changes that happened, perhaps without anybody realizing what was really going on, is Senator Gerard Craughwell. And you wrote about that this week, John, and you used the famous phrase from Howard Beale, "I'm as mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore." Yeah,
I thought it was very similar to that in many ways, because like if you think of that movie, and most people might not have seen it, but it's basically the story of a news anchor who just reads out the news normally, whatever's on the screen, for most of his career and life, and then he gets told he's getting sacked, that he's not up to it anymore. And he basically decides to go rogue, and he starts talking about all the stuff that really annoys him. And all of a sudden, this old grey bloke who no one's interested in anymore, everyone's tuning in to see what he'll say next. And I thought there was a hint of that in Gerard Craughwell this week, because Gerard Craughwell he's the definition of sort of an anonymous senator.
Yes.
We were talking about it during the week. We're trying to figure out when did he get elected, and it was 2014, as it happens. People might remember there was a by-election for the Shannon in which the Fine Gael candidate ran into some difficulties, and Gerard Craughwell was not anyone's favourite to get elected, but kind of, and I mean this with no disrespect to the senator, he kind of won by surprise and by default due to a flaw in the Fine Gael candidate at the time. He's been a senator. He's been a senator ever since. And he voted for the very thing which he's now really annoyed about, which is the Gender Recognition Act. He voted for it because he said he felt it was compassionate.
Well, isn't that what makes it so interesting? That he voted for this, everybody voted for it, nobody demurred against it. I'm sure anybody who did speak against it, like the usual brave souls, like Matthew McGrath, whatever, were just castigated and ignored. And now I think Gerard Craughwell, like many people, is saying, like, hold on a minute, I didn't realize this was what the Gender Recognition Act would lead to. It wouldn't. He's particularly focused, I think, on TENI and on what's being kind of encouraged or be promoted to children in terms of transgenderism. But other people would look at things like the Barbie Kardashian story, and they would say and argue, I never thought that voting for something which I thought, or supporting something which was meant to just help transgender people or people with gender dysphoria, would lead to like a violent male rapist being put into a woman's jail. And the senator is kind of saying the same thing, isn't he? He's kind of saying, well, I voted for this. I thought it was an act of kindness in terms of inclusivity and diversity and everything else. And I'm finding that it's having this horrible outcome where organizations are talking to children under 12, about being transgender and everything else that entails.
What I think is interesting about it is not so much his position, because there are lots of people, lots of politicians who over the years vote for things and then say, oh, I probably shouldn't have voted for that. That's a kind of common enough thing that happens, and you can forgive them. And I think we can forgive Senator Craughwell in this case too. But what's interesting for me is the kind of raw anger. It wasn't just tweets weren't kind of going, I shouldn't have voted for this in retrospect. They were going, I will almost devote the rest of my career to undoing this tremendous error, and I don't care if I lose my seat, and I'm going to war, damn it. That was the tone. And it strikes me that, and I said this in my piece, and I don't know whether you agree with it, that for years the most powerful sort of tool of progressivism in Ireland has been that anger, but directed against the church, over the sense that, rightly in many cases, that people felt deceived, that there was this sense that you were being told something from the pulpit on a Sunday, but priests were doing something different in the privacy of their own homes, and the church was preaching X, Y, and Z, but not practicing it. And there was anger and there was betrayal. And I get the feel, this is the first time I can really remember somebody who had been on the progressive wing kind of saying, I feel betrayed. I feel like I've been lied to. I feel like this message of compassion isn't really about compassion at all. Like that was what I thought was significant for me, because I mean, if you want people saying the kind of things you and I would say about the Gender Recognition Act, I mean, they're 10 a penny. But here's somebody who, well, maybe not 10 a penny, but like, you get it. You're not short of them. Whereas here's somebody who actually is a convert who's expressing a sense of betrayal. And I think that feeling, I think that's what's really dangerous for our friends in inverted commas on the left. If that feeling becomes more widespread, that people are duped, because that's almost more important than the issue itself, I think.
It is. And you see, that's what people especially don't like. I think people won't hold it against you if you have a different opinion to them, but they don't like the feeling that they've been duped. And you use that word in your article, hoodwinked. And I think that actually really described what was coming across in Gerard Craughwell's tweets, because he was furious in the tweets, and he wasn't holding back about what he thought or what he wanted to say. Like somebody said to me when they were reading them that he was being very ballsy. And I know what they meant. Like he was saying what a lot of senators and TDs probably think privately and are afraid to say publicly. And it seems to me that it's part of a kind of a growing trend, and that there may be a tipping point being reached around this issue. And it's really got nothing to do with gender dysphoria or people who are transgender, many of whom I would imagine are kind of dismayed by what has happened over the last few years, and because they're not looking for these kind of crazy outcomes at all. They're not looking to talk to 12-year-old children or 8-year-old children about changing sex. They're not looking to have Barbie Kardashian incarcerated with women. They're just people who want to get on with their lives. But the movement has because it's taken a certain position, it almost seems forced into supporting all of this madness. And Gerard Craughwell has cottoned on to that. And he is, I think, speaking for a lot of people when he's using this very forceful, strong language, kind of, as you say, almost showing that he feels hoodwinked or betrayed or duped by what's happened.
He's definitely not alone, because you and I are both familiar, and we obviously we don't name people on this podcast if they haven't named themselves publicly, but we're both aware of a very senior Fine Gael elder statesman who's going around telling everybody he can talk to about how mad he thinks all this stuff is. And so he's definitely not alone. There are people in politics in Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Of course, in Irish politics, if you're in a party, you're in Fianna Fáil, you're in Fine Gael, Labour, the Greens, you don't speak out on things. You don't rock the boat. That's just, it's almost in the blood. It's not so much a rule as it's just, your tribal loyalty comes first. But and so the fact that he's an independent is probably the reason why he feels safer or more liberated in saying these things.
No, it is. I think that's a really important point. I think it's precisely the independents who are showing, and small parties like Ainto, of course, who are showing courage these days on a whole range of issues. And Paul Murray, who writes for Gript, was formerly an Irish Times journalist, is a beautiful writer, and he has an article today called Hacks, Hamsters and Hush Puppies. And he talks about, the use of language and creating narratives and things like that. And he says, people say, oh, politicians and journalists, they need to be braver. And he has this great phrase, where he says, you think journalists are brave? Hacks are hamsters, not heroes. And he says he's not trying to be disparaging, simply descriptive, and that the majority of journalists don't get to write what they want, or they write what they're allowed to write and what's acceptable to write. I thought it was a very incisive remark, and you could apply the same to politicians. I'm sure, just like the elder statesmen we talked about just now, there are plenty other TDs in Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, and they are deeply uncomfortable with what's happening. They know that the public are deeply uncomfortable with what's happening around this issue, but they say what they're allowed to say and what's acceptable to say instead of saying what they really think.
Do you know what I thought was really interesting in Pohl's article as well, aside from the point he makes about journalists, is the point he makes about the broad tactics that are still employed. Yes. Because he's essentially saying in that piece, because Pohl is a what you might call a northern constitutional nationalist of a certain vintage. So he was around when all the unpleasantness was going on. And he's making the point that it was a very difficult time to be in Northern Ireland during the Troubles as somebody who was both in favour of a united Ireland, but also opposed to the means by which some people were pursuing that. He's saying the difficulty was that if you expressed any view in the 70s and 80s in favor of a united Ireland, there was this sense that you were, for want of a better term, a Ra man, even though you might be. So people like the SDLP had to spend their whole life justifying that actually, they weren't like the very worst people, by the standards of the time. And now the establishment's tendency, and you see this on things like the protests about the libraries or the stuff about immigration, where you have local communities. There's this obsession all the time with trying to paint anybody who expresses any kind of concern as sort of a screaming lula. And that is that's something that Pohl, I thought, really identified in his piece. And it's another reason why I think Gerard Craughwell is so important, because this is somebody who voted for the bill. He's not somebody who you could say is a far right screaming lunatic, in inverted commas. He is somebody who voted for the bill, who was eager to be compassionate, who wanted, like most people in the country do for good reason, to do the right thing. And realizes something went wrong, and I think that's very important. And
he's calling, I think, specifically for action on this. And it would be interesting to see, does that get any traction? Like, he's calling for the Gender Recognition Act to be overturned by one means or another. And I think that the number of voices calling for that specific action, like 2 years ago, was almost not existent, and it was largely due to the huge efforts, I think, then of campaigners who, as you say, like, were always painted by the media as being transphobic or anti-trans or whatever. That this has now begun, I think, to gain traction in amongst the public, and it will be interesting to see where all that leads to in the next several years, because I think the Gender Recognition Act has facilitated all kinds of craziness that definitely does not have public support. But for people who are very committed to the act or to the transgender movement, they would see the reversal of the act as a huge step backwards, as a huge loss, because the act, allows anybody to change their sex without actually meaningfully engaging in anything that should be required to change your sex. So they're committed to this kind of ideology that says you can change your sex every second day if you like. The idea that sex isn't actually real, that gender is a kind of a spectrum, it's fluid, that John can be a woman tomorrow and I can be a man, and the next day we can change our minds, or the next month we can change our minds and become something different. They're very committed to that ideology, and it doesn't make any sense in the real world, but it's at the heart of the Gender Recognition Act.
Well, on that, and we won't spend the whole podcast now talking about the transgender issue, but before we move on, the Barbie Kardashian thing that happened this week, I think is fascinating because of the position in which it places the government. So for those who missed this story, Barbie Kardashian, aka Gabrielle Alejandro Gentil, is an individual who we talked about on this show before, who is biologically male, who is exceptionally violent and has a fixation on violence towards women, but who is legally recognized as a woman under the terms of the Gender Recognition Act. And this week, after that story became just a little bit too hot for the government, he/she/it was finally moved from the female wing of Limerick prison to the male wing. And I don't know how the government can reconcile that, because the law of the land says Barbie Kardashian is legally, Niamh, as much a woman as you are, and yet they have just put her, in inverted commas, into a male prison. I do not see how that would survive a legal challenge when the law of the land says that Barbie Kardashian is a woman.
Precisely, because I think, and I've written about this previously on Gript, that people like Barbie Kardashian, violent males, especially those who either want to or have carried out acts of sexual violence against women, they're trolling everybody. They know they're not women. They're doing this because they can. And the Gender Recognition Act is what allows Barbie Kardashian to enforce the government and the authorities to participate in this absolute farce. But now, the law is the law. Barbie Kardashian is allowed to claim that he is a woman, and now he is in jail with men. And of course there's going to be a court case, probably taken by one of the taxpayer-funded civil rights organisations who will say that his civil rights are being breached and he actually needs to be put back in.
Yeah, well, he's not terrified. To pick up on one thing, he's not allowed to say he's a woman. He's legally a woman.
Yes.
That the law of the land is he's as much a woman in law as you are. So it's not a matter of him saying it. I mean, that's the That's the Gender
Yes.
Recognition Act. But on your point, which I think is a very good one, which we don't really address enough about the trolling that's going on here.
Yeah.
The name itself. I mean, there's been basically nothing written about this, but Barbie Kardashian. He's taken the most overtly sort of comically feminized Mattel character with the tiny waist and the big boobies and all the rest of it, and combined it with Kardashian after the Kardashians. Again, people who would be in many ways sort of exaggerated versions of sort of a certain kind of comic book femininity, and use that as his/her name. It is obviously trolling. I mean, I can't imagine there are many women out there who are seriously embracing womanhood as the full spectrum of womanhood who would deliberately choose for themselves what essentially amounts to a porn star name. I mean, it's obviously trolling, and it's trolling. And when you combine that with the predilection for violence towards women, I mean, it doesn't take a psychiatrist to figure out what's going on there. But apparently, the government can't see it or couldn't see it until this week.
Yeah, like he's been described as a homicidal girl. You could ditch the girl part of it, but the homicidal part is very real. Like, this is a deeply, deeply disturbed, deeply violent, deeply manipulative person. And like I know the whole thing is so ridiculous. The photos of him are so ridiculous. The name is so ridiculous that we can forget sometimes, of course, that he is in prison with women who are usually imprisoned for petty crimes. You know, the women are not in prison for violent crimes, and that they have said to Paddy O'Gorman, the podcaster and reporter, that they find this terrifying. You know, they find this deeply frightening that somebody who is a homicidal, violent rapist, a sex offender, is put into prison with them.
Or a point that Sarah makes on this show all the time when this topic comes up, and we keep talking about it, folks, because it's really important. And if we didn't keep talking about it, I'm not saying we deserve all the credit, but if we weren't constantly talking about it, this bloke would probably still be in the women's prison. But a point that Sarah makes as well is think of the prison officers, because obviously there are laws in this country that if I go into prison as a man, I am entitled to have my intimate searches performed by men and vice versa. So a woman is entitled to have a woman perform, in inverted commas, intimate searches, which are often required in prisons for various reasons to do with drugs and everything else. So like, think of the prison officers, what they have to go through. They didn't sign up for that.
They didn't. And the other big story, I think, dominating this week has been RTE and the continued fall in revenue for RTE. And the numbers are pretty startling, really. You know, the report out this week says that TV license sales for the first week in August fell by 900,000 euros, almost €1 million, and that since the controversy broke, in comparison with last year, they're seeing a fall of 3.7 million in TV license revenue, which mostly goes to RTE. So it's very evident, I think, that the public anger that's out there hasn't abated. People are still furious about this story. I'm starting to feel a little bit like I'm not as cool as I used to be. I used to be like the guy who used to write, I don't pay my TV license, I'm not paying for that crap. And now that used to make me like a distinguishing thing. Now everyone's at it. But I remember a couple of weeks ago I wrote about this, that I thought it would go one of two ways. That either, I think it was the first week of June, or the last week of June, first week of July was the first time they really saw a drop. And I remember saying it would either be a blip or it could snowball. Like, it could really snowball because I mean, with the best will in the world, we haven't got the prison places and we haven't got the court's capacity to prosecute everybody. That's just not going to happen. There's safety in numbers. And if more and more people ain't paying, then more and more people who are still paying will think that they're mugs for doing so. And the whole house of cards could collapse fairly quickly. But I wonder, Niamh, whether that might not be a sort of blessing in disguise for those like Timmy Dooley, for example, the Fianna Fáil senator, former TD, who are desperate to get rid of the TV license anyway, so they can just jack up taxes and everything else and give everyone in the media free money. Yeah, like a couple of things struck me about this story. One was that I think some people who in July might have been feeling, oh God, you know, I'm not going to pay my TV license, as a kind of a protest against what they were reading, were probably encouraged. You know, remember that judge Anthony Halpin in the Dublin District Court, who said he described RT as people working there, some people working there as freeloaders who were involved in shenanigans that had left him appalled and disgusted. And he offered sympathy to people before him who hadn't paid their license to date. And I think that was a remarkable thing for punters who perhaps hadn't paid their license or were considering not paying their license, to see that this judge has great sympathy for them, and he was slamming the elitism in RTE and their attitude towards the taxpayer, towards people who are paying the TV license. But and maybe that encouraged others, also to withhold the TV license fee, because definitely the drop is huge. But you're absolutely right, John. What's going to happen now is that RTE, despite the fact that they're, describing themselves as being covered in shame, or they're apologising for what happened in relation to the payments to Tubridy and everything else, they're just simply going to come back now and demand more money because people haven't paid their TV license. They're going to say, well, we're down 3.7 million because people, haven't paid up in July and August, so we're going to need that back from the taxpayer. Thanks very much. And they'll probably get it. This is the joke of the thing, like that people are upset about what was paid to Tubridy, but RTE is getting almost 200 million in TV license fees from the taxpayer, and they're going to probably ask for more now if there's any shortfall in what's been gathered.
Yeah, and there is this huge hunger, and it's not just confined to RTE. I mean, like all the other media outlets, with the exception of ours, are gasping to get their hands out for money, because, as we know, the media is a sort of an institution that's very difficult, as you and I well know, Niamh, to make money in media. It's very difficult because people don't necessarily see why they should pay for something that in many cases they can read on their screens for free. That's understandable. And so a lot of the Irish Times, the Indo, the Examiner, all of them, and the local stations as well, are gasping for government subsidy. And there are many people in the government who are gasping to give it to them, because I suspect, though this is never said outright, but it's interesting when Timmy Dooley, who's sort of making the running on this, talks about this. He talks about the dangers of disinformation and the need for quality journalism. Like, there's obviously an eagerness among some in the political class to combat the rise of, in inverted commas, disinformation, i.e. people talking about things like Barbie Kardashian, by giving the media incentives to stay on side and all the rest of it. So there's a hunger to do this. But I think the person who it's really bad news for, though, is poor old Ryan Tubridy himself. Because I think if the government is going to turn around and bail out RTE over the TV license, there will have to be a sacrifice. There will have to be somebody who is sacrificed on the altar of, see, we've changed and we're better and we're different now and there's accountability. And I think poor old Ryan Tubridy, despite all his articles about how great Sinead O'Connor was, I think he is going to find it very difficult to get his job back.
Yeah, most likely. I would say that's correct. It's extraordinary, though, because I don't, the old adage, John, that you don't bite the hand that feeds you, obviously applies here. And I think it is really perverse for the Irish media to look for RTE has always been publicly funded, but for the entirety of the Irish media to look for public funding from the government, because surely everybody knows this, that if the government is funding you, how does that then impact on how you report on government policies and government actions, on everything else related to definitely like the political goings on in the country? Yet I think for a lot of the media, they're just thinking it's really, really hard to break even. It's really, really hard to get subscriptions. Therefore, we're just going to take the easy route and go and get it from Timmy Dooley and his friends, who, I mean, do they seriously imagine there's not going to be demand for a favour returned?
I think it's worse than that. I do think it's worse than that. I mean, I was struck this week by Kathy Sheridan in the Irish Times, who wrote a piece saying that criticism of Helen McEntee, the Minister for Justice, is, or what I think was her phrase, bordering on the misogynistic. And it strikes me, I mean, one of the things that I've been saying about most of the media in Ireland now for a long time is that in most democracies, when you think of a democracy and the role of the media, it is supposed to be to hold the powerful to account on behalf of the public. But in the way we've structured society, which is where, you have, in essence, a ruling class that is broader than simply the politicians. It encompasses civil servants and journalists and NGOs and charities and some of the big corporations, many of whom are sort of interconnected, and people move freely from a job in one to the other. A lot of the media, especially with their employment opportunities now almost outside of journalism, now almost always being going to work for a politician or going to work for a charity or going to work for, like, it's been inverted. So now that many of the media seem to see their job as being to hold the public to account on behalf of the people in power. And I thought that was like Kathy Sheridan's piece summed that up. How dare you criticize Helen McEntee, you misogynists? I mean, that's not journalism, because, I mean, the public are not the ones with power. These are the same people who will lecture a comedian who makes a joke about the transgender stuff for punching down, in inverted commas. These people punch down all the time. So I don't think there's any sense of conflict or any sense of sort of conflict of interest in taking money from the government, because in many cases, not all, but in many cases, it'd just be to continue doing what they're doing anyway, which is broadly upholding the status quo, which is good for journalists.
I mean, the Kathy Sheridan article was just entirely ridiculous. And I think it's part of a trend. It's part of two trends. One, ever since Helen McEntee has come back from maternity leave, she's been given one soft interview after another, because I think, especially for female journalists, they think she's an example for young women as to a woman who can have it all. But if Helen McEntee was a man, and the outrage, public outrage we are seeing about O'Connell Street being turned into a cesspit, about the levels of crime in this country was directed at her, nobody would take any issue with that. Yet because Helen McEntee is a woman, any criticism of her is kind of waved away by people like Kathy Sheridan as bordering on misogyny. And that absolutely drives me nuts. Like, women do not want to be judged through this lens where we're given leeway or excuses are made for us because we're women. We should be judged on a record. And that should apply not just to women in government, but to women across the board. There is no equality. It's this kind of false equality where excuses are going to be made for us and criticism is deflected because we're women. That's not equality, it's bullshit.
I mean, I agree with you, but I'd refine it a bit more in that it's not simply because she's a woman. I mean, where was Kathy Sheridan writing articles about criticism of ministers being misogynistic when Mary Harney was being kicked from pillar to post in this country?
Yeah.
Abused over her weight, called all sorts of names. Her looks were made fun of. Where was Kathy Sheridan? Didn't give a flying you-know-what, or appeared not to, never wrote a word about it, because Mary Harney is not ideologically simpatico. If it was you, Niamh, and to many people in Ireland, you and people like you, and indeed me and people like me, are the great demons. The backwards looking, anti-choice, right-wing, gay, whatever they call us.
Yeah.
There's no sort of like, we can't criticize women in politics. Then no. It was Lucinda Creighton got when she started Renua. I mean, bullshit. Absolute bullshit. So there's so yeah. The broader point is, I don't think the media need a financial incentive to do what many of them are doing, and that's the unfortunate thing. Which is why I'm glad to say we're at Gript, we're growing slowly and not as fast as we'd like, but we're growing. On that note, before we forget to mention it, for listeners may have seen that we have an event actually that we're organizing on the 16th of September in the RDS, which is it's not a campaigning event because we're a media outlet and we can't and do not campaign, but we did think it was important, Niamh, to set up an event for people to come and talk through and set out the arguments that are important to people in the media who need free speech and to members of the public who need their free speech about why the hate speech bill is potentially problematic. So that's happening on the 16th of September in the RDS. If you're a subscriber to Gript, if you're a gold or a silver subscriber, we'll give you a free ticket to say thank you. And if you're anybody else, tickets are only 15 quid anyway. So we'd love for you to come. There's a great lineup of speakers, maybe excluding me. You probably hear enough from me, but we've got people like Michael Schellenberger. We've got Ben Scallon, of course, who's going to do some talking. We've got Senator Sharon Keoghan. We've got
Helen Joyce,
loads of people. So that'll be a great event.
I think it will. I think it's very interesting how much opposition is now being raised to the hate speech bill, because it looked like something that was done and dusted, I think, just a few months ago, didn't it, John? And by dint, I think, of pure grassroots activism and some independent voices speaking out, it certainly stalled anyway, like, because people, I think, are so concerned about free speech and this kind of new era of censorship And censorship sounds like a strong word. I think it reminds people of burning books or of jailing people like for saying the wrong thing in authoritarian regimes. But it's this new strange kind of censorship where sometimes we censor ourselves. People are afraid to say what they think a lot of the time. But the hate speech bill, I think people's concerns about that is that it would be used to bring the full ramifications of the law down on people who have unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I think. What do I think about this? I think there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, coming back to the very first thing we talked about, which was Gerard Craughwell voting for whatever it is now, 2014, nearly 9 years ago, for the Gender Recognition Act. The same arguments are being used over and over again, no matter what the progressives in this country want to do. It's always the same. This is the kind and compassionate thing to do to protect the most vulnerable in our society and recognize women and minorities, whatever it is. And that argument's been rolled out again, and people have had it up to here with it because they're increasingly seeing the degree to which that argument is emotionally driven bullshit. And I think they can see through it in this case too. It is not kind and compassionate. You have a story that just went up before we started recording this podcast about something that happened in the UK this week, where an autistic girl in her teens allegedly said about a female police officer that she looks like she's a lesbian like nan. So this autistic girl who's 16, and we know autistic people don't always communicate in the way that everyone else would, said she looks like my nan who happens to be a lesbian. And tell us what happened.
So this video went up yesterday, and all of the details around it aren't confirmed. Just to say that, John, at this point, but what you can see in the video, I have to say, is really distressing. And if there's anybody listening who has a member of the family or the extended family who has autism, they'll understand why the behaviour of the police in relation to this teenage girl, she looks to be about 16 or 17, we're not sure of her age, it's just so outrageous. So the police are seen coming in the girl's home, and the girl's mother, and again, all of these details have to be confirmed, but this interaction is captured on video. The girl's mother is pleading with them not to arrest the girl, who at this stage is hiding in this kind of cupboard under the stairs and is clearly terrified. And people with autism very often start to hit themselves, start to kind of engage in self-harming especially when they're frightened or distressed. And the girl is engaging in that. The scene is just terrible. And the mother says then to the police officers, police officer says she's going to be arrested, and the mother says that she's autistic, and the policewoman, stony face, responds, "I don't care." And then a male police officer is heard saying that homophobic remarks were made at his colleague, and the mother says that her daughter said, "I think she is a lesbian like Nana." And the mother is arguing here that the child simply thought that one of the police officers, a police woman, and we think from the video, is a lesbian like her grandmother. There was nothing insulting or homophobic about it, but the police persist, and there's at least 6 police officers in the house. Like, the teenager at this point is screaming and crying as they try to drag her out of the cupboard under the stairs, and they then remove her from the house, and the whole thing is just horrific. Like, it's absolutely horrific, because I think, for several reasons. One, if the child made a remark like this, surely one police officer coming in and talking to the family would have been sufficient. 2, we are told repeatedly that police forces here and in the UK, and you can see actually the West Yorkshire police, who are the police involved in this case, they've been posting about training in dealing with people with autism. You presume that they've undergone special training so that they know how to deal, especially with young people who have autism. They know how to manage that encounter, and certainly none of the people crowding into that house, it looks like a small hallway, and dealing with that child, could possibly have undergone any training in dealing with people with autism. And then, of course, people are looking at the bigger picture, even though the full details have, again, as I say, have not come out yet, in relation to free speech and hate speech bills and how they're used and how the authorities use them, and the complete overreaction that seems to have taken place and seems to be captured in this video.
The other point here is that, let us take as given, which we shouldn't, let's take as a given that homophobia should be a crime. Which I don't agree with, but let's take. How is saying as this child did, that somebody looks like a lesbian, how is that homophobic? That needs to be established in my mind first, because I mean, there's an assumption there implicitly that looking like a lesbian, in inverted commas, is a homophobic remark, when we have months and months of the year devoted to LGBT pride and taking pride in being out and proud and looking like a lesbian, in inverted commas, in some cases. I mean, the assumption that's being, I mean, this is the issue, is that hate speech laws are all about matters of perception. You do not have to intend any offense to be prosecuted. That is and that's what's in this bill that is particularly terrifying, I think. It's that it's got what's called in law a subjective test. So if somebody feels offended by what you've said, or feels hated, to use the term, by what you've said, then it doesn't really matter if you intended to say something hateful or not. You've committed a crime. And this video is a great example of that, because all it takes is what it was on the face of it. And as you've said, the full details haven't come out, but people can watch the video, which is on our website, for themselves, to see the degree and the lack of proportion in the reaction. But what seems to have been said is remarkably inoffensive. So yeah, I think people are
You're right, and like, even if the teenager had said, you know, you're a lesbian, like, is that homophobia? Especially when it's an autistic child. A lot of things have to be taken in context, and you're right about that, child.
We are told that that's something to be proud of. And by the way, I'm not saying it's not. When I say we're told it's something to be proud of, people should be absolutely proud to be themselves in a society. But saying if you told me that I look like an American, or I look, that's not offensive. It's you have to, there's a sort of this idea simultaneously that being LGBT is something to be proud of, which is supposedly the progressive and correct approach, and also this idea that if somebody else notices it, it's something to be ashamed of. There's a contradiction.
There is, and even if the child had made a remark which a police officer considered offensive, was there any need for this complete over-the-top reaction? And I saw Caroline Farrow, who has been visited by police. She's a campaigner in the UK who has been visited by police several times.
They basically live in her house now, I think, the police.
Several times over what they considered. Actually, in fairness, she's been visited by police several times over complaints made by other activists saying that she posted offensive tweets. And you know, she says the same thing, that it was often 3 or 4 officers who came to her door to investigate a tweet. And you can't blame people for looking at this kind of nonsense and then looking at this really distressing video of this particular girl being arrested and not making like the very obvious remark, which is like, you can't get a policeman or a garda when you need one. You're looking at this absurdity.
Yeah, and it is a form of, this is the other thing about the hate speech bill, and all hate speech laws, is that they are by definition political policing. Because you mentioned Caroline Farrow. Now, Caroline Farrow is somebody who I would agree with on some things, but I would consider Caroline, and I mean this with no disrespect to her at all, but her basic political worldview is that of a very orthodox Catholic. That's a fair assumption, isn't it, Niamh? It's fair description. So she would have very strong views on things like, no more than I do, on things like abortion, gay marriage, euthanasia, and she would articulate those in a particularly Catholic way. You don't have to. But
she's very respectful, though. Like, I've never seen her be anything except respectful to people.
I'm not saying she's not, but what I am saying is that those views in the modern society in which we live would, in many cases, be sort of views that a lot of people would disagree with. And because she articulates those views, that's what, it's not that I've never seen any of her tweets that are objectively offensive, unless it is now the law of the land that to hold what one might call traditionally Catholic, or indeed Anglican, or indeed Muslim views is illegal. That's the point I'm making.
Or John, just common sense views, like just to say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, or there are 2 genders. This now seems to be a terribly offensive thing to say. Perhaps even might even have legal repercussions if the hate speech bill goes through. Like, that's how extraordinary things have come, and I think that's why it's not just Catholics or Christians or Muslims who are getting really, really concerned about the direction the world is taking in this regard. You know, because they're saying that every person. That's the funny thing about free speech, isn't it, John? You don't really care about it until your own is impinged. You know, and I think that's why we've seen this maybe this surge now of opposition to the hate speech bill, because people are realizing, hey, it doesn't just apply to the religious or the politically active or to people who have a minority viewpoint. It could very easily apply to me. And I think actually on that, it's interesting, go back to Paul Murray's article about the protests against migrant centres in different areas. You've pointed this out, that RTE and other media outlets mostly never went down to talk to the local people in those areas. But Gript has, and I went to Ballybrack myself a couple of weeks ago with Fatima Gunning, and what most of the people there said to us was, I've never protested on anything like this. I have no issue with people coming into the country. And this is the first time I've done this because it impacted on my locality and on my community and where I live, and the fears I have for the people living in the community if like 80 or 100 strangers are suddenly brought in here.
You know, because we talk about this behind the scenes and we're discussing what we're writing about. This is a bugbear of mine, right? That people do, and I think it's one of the problems with the country, and it's one of the reasons why progressivism is such a dominant ideology, which is that people don't really object to it until it affects them. So like one of the things that kind of bothers me, and I respect everyone who is protesting for any reason and using their right of free speech to make their voice heard. They're an important part of the political process. But like, it does bother me when people start protesting because their area is affected. I mean, if this isn't right for your area, then it's not necessarily right for the whole country. And there's this apologetic. Finish the point. There's this almost apologetic tone to it, which is that, oh, well, obviously we disagree with this policy here, but it's fine in principle. When I suspect what they honestly mean is it's not fine in principle. It's madness to be bringing in hundreds of thousands of people when we've got a housing crisis and can't accommodate them.
But you can think those two things simultaneously. The polls show that there is a widespread, very large majority of people who feel that we now have kind of lost control, if you like, of the immigration situation, or feel that we have taken enough refugees. Or all those kind of statements receive huge majority support in the opinion polls. But people can see that the government just seems to be ignoring that. Is there any other policy where you've got 75% of people, or these huge numbers in the opinion polls saying, we don't agree with what the government is doing here, and the government just continues on irregardless? Mm-hmm. And I think that's why you see people then protesting locally, because it's happening in their own community. They want to do something about it there. They are telling pollsters, probably TDs too, that they disagree with the national policy, but they're just being ignored, completely ignored. It's astonishing, really.
Mm-hmm. No, you're completely correct. And the other issue in which this is a real a growing issue, I think, is climate stuff. And I want to talk about this before we go, because I've got a piece coming out on it tomorrow, which is for paying subscribers only. But the launch this week of the Farmers Alliance, or I think what are they called, the Agricultural Alliance political party. I'm going to get their name right if it kills me, so bear with me a second.
You'll be shot.
Yeah, I think they're called the Farmers Alliance. I'm right, the Farmers Alliance, which is launching, it says, a political party and a political movement, and it is targeted almost entirely at the environmental agenda that's being imposed by the government, which the Farmers Journal this week said 75% of farmers would vote for a new political party that's targeted at their issues. And I think this is another issue where the government are completely out of step with maybe not all the public, because maybe the polling is different in cities, but in rural Ireland at least, the opposition to all this green nonsense. And by the way, when I say green nonsense, I'm not talking about things like protecting the oceans or planting more trees. I'm talking about things like killing cows. Is going off the scale, and politicians don't seem to care or don't seem to notice. And anyway, what do you think their prospects of success are?
Yeah, it depends really, John, how well I think the different groupings here can work together. Because you already have the rural independent grouping, which has TDs all over the country, which has, I think, very strong spokespersons on, like Michael Collins, Matt McGrath, on farming issues. And I think it would be a shame if the two groupings didn't try to come together, I suppose with aim to as well, like any of the newer political parties who are focused on rural issues, I think it would serve them well to work together, try to maximise their votes rather than going up against each other in the different constituencies. But it's absolutely, like, without question, that rural communities are enormously upset with this government and with I have relations that live in Clare, for example, and they see the government as being completely in the pocket of Eamon Ryan, and it's hard to disagree with them. And they see that a party which gets a tiny percentage of the vote at every election, and only really recovered in the last election from more or less being wiped out before that, is allowed to dictate policy to such an extent that farmers are arguing that they're going to be wiped out. Do you know that beef farming, dairy farming, things that have been at the backbone of the economy in this country for generations, they feel that it's going to be wiped out?
Well, I often find it very amusing in sort of a dark way when I see, as I often do, people describing Eamon Ryan as incompetent or doesn't know what he's doing. The man is probably the single most competent politician in the country. And that I say that with no joy, because I think his agenda is deleterious and disastrous and doing significant harm and likely to do significant harm. But he is running rings around the two larger parties in the coalition. He is enacting an agenda that, even if he's one of the few politicians in the country who doesn't care whether he loses the next election. He's in there for 5 years. He is doing enough damage that he knows that it won't be undone in 5 years if somebody else replaces him, especially if it's Sinn Féin. Because they broadly acquiesce to most of what he's doing anyway, and mightn't pursue it with the same kind of zealotry, but certainly wouldn't undo it with any zealotry. He doesn't care. So he is enacting an agenda that is going to be very hard to reverse. I think you're correct about the need for groups to work together. I think the independents have a weakness in that they're independent. So, I mean, and I say this with love, because I have great admiration for many of them in that group. But I mean, unless you pool your resources, you can't wield power, and they seem reluctant or unable so far to pool their resources effectively. So I think Aintu and the Farmers Alliance have the right approach in forming a political party that can actually coherently take power. But too many cooks spoil the broth. It'll be very interesting to see how it all works out.
It will, and I think that farmers have some key arguments that most people would agree with it, because a lot of people, I think, don't realise the extent of the harm being caused by a lot of the green policies and the extent of how ridiculous they are. So you have a situation where Irish beef farmers, Irish dairy farmers are going to be, they feel, compelled to close their farms, to move away from providing food for Ireland and then for exporting food as well. And we're going to instead import food from countries as far away as Brazil, and everything that goes with that in terms of the miles the food had to travel, climate costs and everything like that. Like, a lot of what they're saying is true, and it makes absolutely no sense at all. And it reminds me of, what happened in relation to turf. That we rushed to close down the harvesting of peat, and ignoring the fact, for example, that we also needed peat for horticulture and things like that. And then we started importing the baguettes from Latvia and elsewhere. Like, there is an absolute kind of sense of chaos and madness around a lot of the implementation of these green policies, and a sense that none of it really kind of makes any sense in real terms. Like, how can it make sense to bring in beef from Brazil when we're putting our own farmers out of business? And I think if there were strong, I think the rural voices, if they come together in a very coherent way, working together, they will get that message out to ordinary people better than it's currently being heard.
They also pose a unique threat to the two bigger parties, because people forget that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael both had terrible elections in Dublin the last election. They're reliant on rural Ireland for the bulk of their seats, so they're vulnerable to this. But there are also two things you didn't mention, which I think are important. Firstly, that many dairy farmers massively expanded their operations on the explicit instruction of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael when milk quotas were lifted by the European Union, and grants were provided to expand your operation, build out your milking parlour, expand your herd from 100 to 200 cattle. And now they're being told, actually, no, do you know what? We're going to have to slaughter all those cattle again. That's the first thing that I think is driving people demented, because they've been driven into, in many cases, massive debts to
Yeah.
expand the operations on the instruction of a government that is now saying, actually, do you know what, that's a mistake, we're melting the polar ice caps. And the second thing is, of course, that Brazil is expanding its herd at the same time, and doing so in a way that's much more deleterious to the environment, because Ireland is already massively deforested. We don't have much tree covering here, and what we have is mainly for farming, it's pine. Whereas in Brazil, where every Irish cow that's killed is getting replaced by 5 new ones in Brazil, they're building it on top of the Amazon. So it's insanity.
It's insanity, and you can see why the farmers are so upset. And a lot of it, I think, speaks to this very unfortunate attitude in the Irish government, which always seems to place the Irish people paddy last. You know, like, we have to be seen to keep up with European standards. We have to be seen to comply with European directives. It doesn't seem to matter what's good for this country and for the people living in this country. I also think it's really important that any country, any nation is able to effectively feed itself. I understand you always have imports and exports, but that any nation is able to feed itself. And when you go shopping on a weekly basis, John, I'm sure you're the same, and you see in a country which is meant to be adopting green policies, like fruit and veg coming from Peru and Israel and South America, it just seems to me that we have gone so far away from this kind of idea of local production and cherishing farmers, acknowledging the very important work that they do, that you can see why farmers get so upset about this. I find that farmers are frequently written about in the Irish media in a really disparaging way. You know, the important work that they do, the important contribution that they make, the essential contribution they make. We can live without journalists and Facebook. You can't live without food, you know, is often just completely disregarded in a lot of the commentary around them, especially from people who have bought completely into kind of the green agenda. But I like you, when I say the green agenda, I don't mean I want to protect like the oceans. I want us to be sensible about protecting the earth, but this kind of climate hysteria, which always paints farmers and sometimes human beings as an enemy to the planet.
Well, we're almost out of time, but before we go, I just want to make one last point on what you've just said, because there's another element to this which never gets the attention it needs, which is the class war element to it. Because nobody cares that people in leafy South Dublin are eating bananas imported from Madagascar. Nobody cares that they're eating almond milk imported from another corner of the world. Nobody cares about quinoa that's being produced in South America and shipped here at high cost, and the forest that's being getting rid of to produce that. Nobody cares about the coconut milk if you are of a particular class in this country, you can do what you want without ever giving a damn about the impact of your consumption habits on agriculture or the planet. But if you are Mammy and Daddy Roberts or Smith down the country, eating 6 pork sausages with the spuds for your dinner and going for an old burger, well, sure, you're the problem because you're destroying the environment. And this is the same across the entire green agenda everywhere. The class war element to it is enormous. You know, cycle lanes for Rathgar, but give people 10 cars to a village in Strokestown. It is. And until people wake up to that and see that the green agenda, and I'm not saying this is deliberate because they're politicians, right? They have to win votes. But the extent to which the snooty Lord Haw-Haws in Dublin get away with murder, and no one says anything about them while they eat their exotic imported foods, while the poor farmer is blamed for everything, is, I think, outrageous. And it's about time somebody said that.
Completely agree. There's a writer called Rob Henderson, and he argues that a lot of the time waving your green credentials is, you know, like owning a luxury good. I think he's spot on.
Do you know, I was watching, because, you know, I know you wouldn't approve, but I love the cricket, and I was watching the Ashes earlier on this summer. And the kind of people who invade a cricket pitch to throw orange powder on the wicket, or people who go in and throw orange paint at paintings, or the people who tried to stop the Open Championship by, again, throwing orange powder. They aren't from working class areas. They've all been to private schools. They're all, you know, they're all like, they are members of a particular class. And I think, you know, there's an elitism to this as well. Which,
there is.
Anyway,
we won't hold the cricket against you, John.
No, well, it was brilliant this year. Brilliant. People should take it up. Fantastic sport. Anyway, that is it, I'm afraid, for this week. Niamh, it's been a delight to have you on the show. We'll have to have you back. Sarah, I think, is gone for another 2 weeks, although she might pop in if she gets bored on her holiday, and Keith.
She might.
Annoys her too much. But until this week, from me and from Niamh, that, my friends, was the week that really was.